My husband treated my daughter like a criminal for a B minus, while his son failed 3 classes and got ice cream. I reminded him my name was on the deed. I met Kevin when my daughter Zoe was 6 years old. He seemed like a good man back then. He had a steady job at a car dealership and a son named Austin who was a year older than Zoe. Kevin said he wanted a real family. He said he always dreamed of having a house full of kids and dinners together and someone to come home to. I believed him. Zoe's biological father left before she was born, so I thought Kevin was a gift. I thought he was going to be the dad she deserved. We got married when Zoe was 8. That's when things started to change. Kevin had rules for Zoe that he did not have for Austin. Zoe had to finish all her homework before she could watch television. Austin could play video games whenever he wanted. Zoe had a bedtime of 8:30 even on weekends. Austin stayed up until 11 most nights. Zoe had to eat everything on her plate, including the vegetables. Austin lived on chicken nuggets and french fries because Kevin said he was a picky eater and we should not force him. I brought it up once in the first year. I said it seemed like the kids had different standards. Kevin said Austin had been through a lot with the divorce and needed extra patience. He said Zoe was younger, so it was important to build good habits early. He said I was overthinking it and making problems where there were none. I let it go because I wanted peace. Zoe was a good kid. She followed the rules without complaining. She did her homework on time. She cleaned her room without being asked. She said please and thank you and helped me with dishes after dinner. Austin never did any of those things, but Kevin said boys were just different. He said Austin would grow out of it eventually. By the time Zoe was 12, the gap was impossible to ignore. Kevin checked Zoe's grades online every single day. If she dropped from an A to a B, he would sit her down for a lecture about responsibility and potential. He made her do extra practice problems on weekends. He took away her phone for a week once because she got a C+ on a math quiz. Meanwhile, Austin was barely passing anything. His teacher sent emails about missing assignments. His report cards were full of D's and comments about lack of effort. Kevin always had an excuse. He said Austin was not being challenged enough. He said the teachers did not understand his learning style. He said some kids were just not built for traditional school. I paid for everything in our house. My job as an accountant covered the mortgage, the utilities, the groceries, the car payments. Kevin's commission at the dealership went up and down, so most months I carried us. He never thanked me for it. He acted like it was normal for me to work 50 hours a week while he criticized my daughter for not being perfect. Last November, Zoe brought home her report card. She had 5 A's and 1 B- in science. She was nervous to show Kevin because she knew how he would react. She was right. Kevin looked at that report card like she brought home a criminal record. He said a B- was unacceptable. He said she was getting lazy and needed a wake-up call. He grounded her for 2 weeks. No phone, no friends, no television, no nothing. Zoe cried in her room all night. I went to comfort her, but Kevin told me I was coddling her. He said she needed to learn that the real world does not give participation trophies. That same week, Austin's report card came in the mail. He failed English, math, and history. 3 F's in 1 semester. Kevin looked at it and sighed like it was a minor inconvenience. He told Austin to try harder next time, and then asked him if he wanted to go get ice cream. I watched my daughter do extra homework at the kitchen table, while my stepson ate a sundae on the couch. Something broke inside me that night. I did not say anything right away. I waited until Sunday dinner when everyone was at the table together. Kevin was talking about how Austin's basketball team might make the playoffs. He was so proud. He said Austin was really finding his confidence on the court. I waited for him to finish. Then I asked Kevin a question. I asked him why Zoe was grounded for a B- when Austin failed 3 classes. Kevin stopped chewing. He said those were different situations. I asked how. He said Austin was dealing with a lot of pressure from basketball. I asked what pressure Zoe was dealing with when she had a stepfather who treated her like a criminal for not being perfect. Kevin's face turned red. He told me not to start this in front of the kids. I said the kids already knew. I said Zoe had known for years that she was held to a different standard than Austin. I said Austin probably knew too, even if he never admitted it. Kevin pushed back from the table. He said I was being dramatic and ruining dinner. I said I was being honest for the first time in 6 years. I asked him again to explain why my daughter was punished for a B- when his son failed 3 classes. He could not answer. He just sat there getting redder and angrier. I stood up from the table before I could change my mind. The chair legs scraped against the floor so loud it made both kids flinch. Kevin pushed his plate away and walked out of the dining room without looking at any of us. His footsteps pounded up the stairs, and then our bedroom door slammed hard enough to rattle the picture frames in the hallway. The sound hung in the air for a few seconds while nobody moved. Zoe kept her eyes on her plate like she was studying it for a test. Austin pulled out his phone and started scrolling through something even though he knew phones weren't allowed at dinner. I watched him do it and didn't say anything because what was the point? The rules only applied to one kid in this house anyway. I could hear Kevin pacing back and forth upstairs. The old floorboards creaked with every step. Back and forth, like a caged animal looking for a way out. Zoe finally looked up at me with those big brown eyes that always made my chest hurt. She looked scared and guilty at the same time, like she thought this was somehow her fault. I wanted to tell her it wasn't, but my throat felt too tight to get words out. I cleared my throat and told both kids to go to their rooms. Zoe got up right away without arguing. She carried her plate to the sink and rinsed it off even though I didn't ask her to. Austin just sat there for another minute scrolling on his phone before he finally stood up and left his plate on the table with food still on it. I watched him walk away and disappear into his room down the hall. The house got very quiet except for the pacing upstairs. My hands were shaking when I started picking up the dishes. I scraped Austin's leftover chicken and potatoes into the trash can, then Zoe's plate with her vegetables she ate even though she hated green beans. Then Kevin's plate with his half-eaten dinner that he abandoned when I finally said what needed to be said. The trash can filled up with wasted food and wasted money and wasted years. I gripped the edge of the counter and took some deep breaths. The house felt like it was getting smaller and hotter. Like all the anger and hurt from 6 years was pressing down on the walls and ceiling. I knew this wasn't over. Kevin was upstairs working himself into a bigger rage, and eventually he would come back down and we would have the fight we should have had years ago. An hour went by before I heard Kevin's footsteps on the stairs again. I was loading the dishwasher when he walked into the kitchen. He didn't look at me at first. He went straight to the refrigerator and opened it like he was looking for something specific. Then he turned around and asked if there was any dessert left. His voice was calm and normal, like we just had a regular dinner and nothing happened. I stopped loading dishes and looked at him. I told him we needed to finish the conversation he walked away from. His jaw got tight and I saw a muscle jump in his cheek. He said there was nothing to finish and I was making a big deal out of nothing. I asked him if treating our kids differently was nothing. He slammed the refrigerator door and said I embarrassed him in front of the children. His face was getting red again, just like at the table. I pointed out that he embarrassed himself by not having an answer when I asked him a simple question. He said I attacked him and made him look like a bad father. I said he made himself look like a bad father when he grounded Zoe for a B- and took Austin for ice cream after 3 F grades. We went back and forth for 2 hours. Kevin kept saying Austin needed different support because he had a different learning style. He brought up the divorce again like it happened yesterday instead of 8 years ago. He said Austin was still dealing with trauma and needed extra patience. I asked him why Zoe's trauma didn't count. I asked him if having a father who abandoned her before she was born wasn't traumatic enough to deserve some compassion. Kevin didn't have an answer for that. He just stood there opening and closing his mouth like a fish. Then he switched tactics and said I was too hard on Austin and expected too much from him. I laughed because that was rich coming from the man who made Zoe do extra practice problems on weekends. I asked him to name one time he praised Zoe for her grades. One time he told her he was proud of her. One time he gave her any encouragement instead of criticism. He couldn't do it. He tried to say he praised her all the time, but we both knew that was a lie. Every conversation about Zoe's schoolwork was about what she could do better. Every report card was about the one grade that wasn't perfect. Meanwhile, Austin could barely pass, and Kevin acted like it was fine. Kevin finally gave up around midnight. He said he was tired and going to bed, and we could talk about this later when I calmed down. That made me even angrier because I was calm. I was the calmest I had been in years because I was finally saying what I should have said a long time ago. But he walked away again and went upstairs, and I heard the bedroom door close. Not slam this time. Just close. Like he was done with me. I stayed downstairs at the kitchen table with a notebook and a pen. I started writing down every single thing I could remember. Every time Kevin checked Zoe's grades but ignored Austin's missing assignments. Every time Zoe got punished for small things while Austin got away with big things. Every time Kevin made excuses for his son while expecting perfection from my daughter. The list got longer and longer. I filled 3 pages front and back with dates and incidents and examples. Some of them I had forgotten about until I started writing. Like the time Zoe asked if she could stay up late on a Friday night to finish a movie, and Kevin said no, because rules were rules. The same night Austin stayed up until 1 in the morning playing video games, and Kevin didn't say a word. Or the time Zoe forgot her lunch and I had to bring it to the school, and Kevin lectured her for 20 minutes about responsibility. Meanwhile, Austin forgot his homework 3 times in 1 week, and Kevin said the teachers needed to be more understanding. By the time I finished writing, it was almost 2 in the morning and I felt sick. Seeing it all written down like that made it impossible to deny. This wasn't in my head. This wasn't me being sensitive or overreacting. This was real, and it had been happening for years while I stayed quiet and hoped it would get better on its own. Kevin left for work early without saying goodbye. I heard him moving around upstairs at 6 in the morning. Heard the shower running and his closet door opening and closing. Heard him walk down the stairs and grab his keys and go out the front door. He didn't come into the kitchen where I was sitting with my coffee. Didn't say he was leaving or when he would be back. Just left. The kids came down for breakfast around 7 and they were both quiet. They moved around each other carefully like they were afraid of making too much noise. Zoe poured herself cereal and sat at the table without looking at me. Austin grabbed a granola bar and his backpack. I asked if he wanted to sit down and eat a real breakfast, but he said he wasn't hungry. After he left for the bus, Zoe finally spoke. She asked me in this tiny voice if we were getting divorced. The question hit me in the chest. I put down my coffee cup and looked at my daughter. Her eyes were red like she had been crying. I told her honestly that I didn't know what was going to happen, but things needed to change. She nodded and looked back down at her cereal bowl. I wanted to tell her everything would be okay, but I didn't know if that was true. So I just reached across the table and squeezed her hand. I called in sick to work after Zoe left for school. My boss wasn't happy because we had a big deadline coming up, but I told her I had a family emergency, and I would make up the hours later. Then I spent the whole day at the kitchen table with our bank statements and bills spread out in front of me. I made a spreadsheet on my laptop with 2 columns, one for what I paid and one for what Kevin paid. The mortgage was in my name only because I bought the house before we got married. That was $1,200 a month and I paid every cent. The utilities averaged about $300 a month. I paid that. The groceries were around $600 a month. I paid that too. The car payments for both vehicles, insurance for the house and cars, internet and cable, cell phones, Zoe's school supplies and clothes and activities. I paid for all of it. Kevin's commission checks were supposed to help, but they were so up and down that most months he barely covered his own car payment and personal expenses. When I added it all up, I was covering 90% of our household costs. 90%. I sat there looking at the numbers and felt stupid for not doing this math years ago. I was working 50-hour weeks to support a man who thought he had the right to criticize my daughter, while his son failed everything. Kevin came home around 6 with flowers, pink roses and plastic wrap from the grocery store. He walked into the kitchen where I was still sitting with my spreadsheets and held them out like they fixed anything. He said maybe we should just forget about the whole thing and start fresh, like the past 6 years could be erased with cheap flowers and a smile. I looked at those roses, and then at him. I told him I had been keeping track of the unequal treatment for 4 years, and I had the list to prove it. I said fresh starts required actual change, not just apologies and flowers. His smile disappeared. He put the flowers down on the counter and asked what I meant by keeping track. I showed him the 3 pages I wrote the night before. Told him I documented every instance I could remember of him treating the kids differently. He said I was being ridiculous and keeping score like a child. That's when I showed him the financial spreadsheet. Showed him exactly how much I contributed to this household versus his sporadic commission checks. Showed him that my income covered 90% of everything, including the roof over his head. Kevin's face went from regular colored to bright red in about 5 seconds. He said I was holding grudges and keeping score and making him feel small. I said I was holding him accountable and keeping records and making him see the truth. He grabbed my 3-page list off the table and started reading it. I watched his face get redder with each line. He couldn't dismiss it because I had specific dates. I had examples he couldn't argue with. Like October 15th when he grounded Zoe for getting an 87 on a history test, but didn't say anything when Austin brought home a 62 on his English paper. Or September 23rd when Zoe asked to go to a friend's birthday party, and Kevin said no because she hadn't finished her weekend homework yet. But that same day, Austin went to the mall with friends, even though he had 3 missing assignments. Kevin tried to say I was twisting things and taking them out of context. I asked him what context made it okay to punish one child for a B- while rewarding another child for 3 F grades. He didn't have an answer. He just stood there holding my list with his face getting redder and redder, while the grocery store roses wilted on the counter between us. I threw the flowers in the trash while Kevin watched. He flinched like I slapped him. I told him we needed to talk about what happened at dinner, and he tried to walk away again. I grabbed his arm and said no more running from this conversation. He jerked away from me and his voice got loud. He said I planned the whole thing to embarrass him. He said I waited until the kids were there so he could not defend himself. He said I ambushed him at dinner to make him look bad. I stared at him and felt something cold settle in my chest. I told him I did not plan anything. I told him I sat there watching our daughter grounded for 2 weeks over a B-, while his son ate ice cream after failing 3 classes, and something inside me snapped. I said the only person who made him look bad was himself, when he could not answer a simple question about fairness. Kevin's face went purple. He said I turned the kids against him. He said I poisoned them with my attitude. I asked what attitude that was exactly. He said my controlling attitude. My need to keep score and hold grudges. I pulled out my phone and opened the notes app where I kept my list. I read him the first 5 examples out loud. October 15th when he grounded Zoe for an 87, but said nothing about Austin's 62. September 23rd when Zoe could not go to a birthday party because of homework, but Austin went to the mall with 3 missing assignments. August 9th when he made Zoe redo a book report that got an A- because it was not her best work. July 2nd when Austin left dishes in the sink for 4 days, and Kevin said, "Boys forget sometimes." June 18th when Zoe asked for a later bedtime, and Kevin said rules were rules, but Austin stayed up past midnight playing video games that same night. Kevin tried to interrupt, but I kept reading. I had 3 pages of this. 3 pages of dates and details and proof that I was not making it up or exaggerating. He grabbed for my phone, but I stepped back. I told him these were facts, not feelings. I told him he could call it keeping score, but I called it keeping track of how he treated my daughter like she was never good enough while his son could do no wrong. Kevin said I was twisting everything. He said I took normal parenting and made it sound like abuse. I asked him to explain how grounding a child for a B- was normal parenting. I asked him to explain how 3 F grades deserved ice cream. He could not. He just stood there breathing hard with his fists clenched. I told him I was done pretending this was okay. I told him things were going to change, or I was going to make decisions he would not like. He asked if I was threatening him. I said no. I was telling him the truth for the first time in years. He slept in the guest room that night. I heard him pacing until 2 in the morning. The next day, I picked Zoe up from the school and told her we were going out, just the two of us. She looked surprised. We did not do that often because Kevin always wanted family time to include everyone. I took her to the coffee shop near her school and bought her a hot chocolate with extra whipped cream. We sat in the corner booth and I watched her stir her drink without drinking it. I asked her how long she had known about the different rules. She looked up at me with big eyes and I saw her bottom lip start to shake. She said she did not want to talk about it. I told her she could trust me and I needed to know. Zoe put her spoon down and her hands were shaking. She said she knew since she was 9 years old. She said she noticed that Austin got to do things she could not do. She said she noticed that when she made mistakes, Kevin got angry. But when Austin made mistakes, Kevin made excuses. Her voice got quieter and quieter until I could barely hear her. She said she thought it was because she was not good enough. She said she thought if she just tried harder and got better grades and followed all the rules, then maybe Kevin would be proud of her too. I felt like someone punched me in the stomach. My 12-year-old daughter had spent 3 years thinking her stepfather's favoritism was her fault. She blamed herself for not being good enough to earn fair treatment. I reached across the table and took her hands. I told her to look at me. I told her none of this was her fault. I told her she was more than good enough and Kevin's behavior had nothing to do with her worth. She started crying for real then, big tears running down her face while other people in the coffee shop pretended not to notice. I moved to her side of the booth and put my arm around her. I told her things were going to change. She asked me how. I told her I was still figuring that out, but she could trust me to protect her. She leaned against my shoulder and cried until her hot chocolate got cold. When we got home, Kevin was already there. He looked at Zoe's red eyes and asked what was wrong. I told him we had a private conversation, and Zoe went upstairs to her room. Kevin followed me into the kitchen and demanded to know what I said to upset her. I told him I asked her how long she knew about the different rules, and she told me she blamed herself for not being good enough. I watched his face change. For just a second, he looked guilty. Then he got defensive again and said I was putting words in her mouth. I said those were her exact words, not mine. I called Zoe's school the next morning and asked to speak to the counselor. The secretary put me through to Tina Barker. I explained that I wanted to discuss my daughter's stress levels and the pressure she had been under at home. Tina said she had time that afternoon if I could come in. I left work early and drove to the middle school. Tina's office was small with posters about feelings and friendship on the walls. She was younger than I expected, maybe early 30s with kind eyes. I sat down and told her everything. I told her about the different rules for Zoe and Austin. I told her about the B- and the grounding and the 3 F grades and the ice cream. I told her about Zoe crying in the coffee shop and saying she thought it was her fault. Tina listened without interrupting. She took notes on a yellow pad. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and nodded slowly. She said she had noticed Zoe seemed anxious. She said Zoe was a perfectionist who got visibly upset over small mistakes. She said Zoe always worried about disappointing people. I asked if that was normal for 12-year-olds. Tina said some kids were naturally anxious, but environmental factors played a big role. She said it sounded like the home environment might be contributing to Zoe's anxiety. She asked if I would be comfortable with her seeing Zoe weekly to help develop coping strategies and build self-esteem. I said yes immediately. Tina made a note and said she would set it up. She looked at me seriously and said she was documenting our conversation. She said if things did not improve at home, there were resources available. I understood what she meant. She was saying if this got worse, she would have to report it. I thanked her and left feeling like at least someone else knew what was happening. At least I was not alone in this anymore. That weekend, I started watching Kevin and the kids like a hawk. Every time he enforced a rule for Zoe, I checked to see if the same rule applied to Austin. Every time he praised Austin, I watched to see if he praised Zoe for similar things. I took notes on my phone. I documented everything in real time. Saturday morning, Kevin told Zoe to clean her room before she could watch television. Her room was already pretty clean, but she went upstairs anyway. Austin's room looked like a tornado hit it, but Kevin did not say anything. I wrote it down. Saturday afternoon, Zoe asked if she could go to her friend Julia's house. Kevin said only if her homework was done. Zoe showed him her completed math worksheet. Kevin checked every answer before he said yes. An hour later, Austin asked if he could go to the basketball court. Kevin said sure, and Austin left without Kevin asking about homework. I wrote it down. Sunday morning, Kevin made Zoe eat her eggs even though she said she was full. He said wasting food was not acceptable. Austin left half his pancakes on his plate and Kevin just cleared them away without comment. I wrote it down. Sunday afternoon, Zoe brought Kevin a science project she was working on and asked for his opinion. Kevin barely looked up from his phone and said it looked fine. Austin showed Kevin a video of a basketball dunk and Kevin watched it 3 times and told Austin how cool it was. I wrote it down. By Sunday night, I had 11 new examples from just 3 days. 11 times Kevin held Zoe to a different standard than Austin. 11 times he was stricter or colder, or less interested in my daughter compared to his son. I sat on my bed that night reading through my notes and felt sick. Kevin came into the bedroom and saw me on my phone. He asked what I was doing. I looked up at him and said I was documenting the pattern he claimed did not exist. His face went red. He asked what that meant. I showed him my phone screen with the list of examples from the weekend. I watched him read through them. He said I was crazy. He said keeping a running record of normal parenting decisions was insane. I told him there was nothing normal about any of this. I told him other people would see these examples and recognize the favoritism immediately. He said I was making something out of nothing. I said 11 examples in 3 days was not nothing. He tried to grab my phone again, but I pulled it away. I told him I was keeping these notes and adding to them every single day. I told him eventually he would have to face what he was doing to my daughter. He called me paranoid. He said I was looking for problems because I wanted to be right. I said I did not want to be right about this. I said I wished I was wrong. I wished my husband treated both kids fairly. But the evidence said otherwise, and I was not going to ignore it anymore. Kevin stormed out and slammed the door so hard a picture fell off the wall. Monday afternoon, Austin's school called. The secretary said they needed to schedule a mandatory parent conference about Austin's failing grades and missing assignments. I said we would both be there and asked when. She gave me a time for Wednesday after school. When Kevin got home, I told him about the conference. He said he would handle it. I said we were both going. He said there was no need for both of us to take time off work. I reminded him that I was the one paying for everything in this house, including the roof over Austin's head. So yes, I was going to the conference about his son's failures. Kevin looked like he wanted to argue, but he just nodded and walked away. Wednesday came and we drove to Austin's high school in silence. The principal was there along with Austin's English teacher, math teacher, and history teacher. They sat on one side of the table and Kevin and I sat on the other. The English teacher started. She said Austin was a bright kid with a lot of potential, but he put in zero effort. She said he had not turned in the last 4 assignments. She said he spent class time on his phone or talking to friends. The math teacher agreed. He said Austin could do the work when he tried, but he rarely tried. He said Austin seemed to think he could charm his way through without actually learning anything. The history teacher said Austin failed the last 2 tests because he did not study. She said she offered him extra credit opportunities and he never took them. The principal asked what was going on at home that might explain Austin's lack of motivation. Kevin immediately started making excuses. He said Austin was overwhelmed with basketball. He said the teachers did not understand his learning style. He said maybe the curriculum was not engaging enough. I watched the teachers' faces and saw them exchange looks. I interrupted Kevin and asked what consequences the school recommended. The English teacher said Austin needed to be held accountable. She said he needed to understand that actions had consequences. The principal said they were putting Austin on academic probation, and if his grades did not improve by the end of the semester, he would not be eligible for basketball. Kevin started to protest, but I thanked them for their time and said we would make sure Austin faced appropriate consequences at home. On the drive home, Kevin was silent for the first 10 minutes. Then he exploded. He said I undermined him in front of Austin's teachers. He said I made him look like he did not care about his son's education. I kept my eyes on the road and my hands steady on the wheel. I told him he undermined himself by making excuses instead of holding Austin accountable. I told him I was done watching him enable Austin's failure while crushing Zoe under impossible standards. Kevin said I did not understand boys. He said Austin needed encouragement, not punishment. I pulled the car over into a parking lot and put it in the park. I turned to look at Kevin directly. I told him that I was done with his excuses. I told him that Austin was failing because Kevin let him fail. I told him that Zoe was anxious and perfectionistic because Kevin made her think anything less than perfect was unacceptable. I told him he was hurting both kids with his different standards, just in different ways. Kevin said I was trying to turn Austin into someone he was not. I said no. I was trying to help Austin become someone who took responsibility for his choices. I said Kevin was the one trying to turn Zoe into some impossible ideal that no 12-year-old could achieve. We sat there in the parking lot and I realized something. Kevin was never going to change unless I forced him to. He was never going to see what he was doing unless I made the consequences real. I started the car again and drove home without saying another word. I pulled the car over into an empty parking lot on the edge of town and put it in the park. My hands shook on the steering wheel, but my voice came out steady and clear. I told Kevin that my name was the only one on the house deed. I told him my income paid the mortgage and the utilities and the groceries and everything else that kept our family running. I told him if he wanted to continue living in my house, he needed to start treating both kids fairly. Kevin's face went from red to white in about 3 seconds. He stared at me like I had just pulled out a weapon. He said I was threatening him. He said I was using money to control him, and that was abuse. I told him holding my daughter to impossible standards while letting his son fail was abuse, and I was done watching it happen. He said I was twisting everything and making him sound like a monster. I said he was making himself sound like a monster every time he grounded Zoe for a B- and rewarded Austin for 3 F grades. Kevin opened his mouth and closed it twice without saying anything. Then he told me to take him home because this conversation was over. I drove home in complete silence with my jaw clenched so tight it hurt. Kevin did not speak to me for 2 days straight. He slept in the guest room and left for work before I woke up and came home after dinner was already on the table. He walked past me in the hallway without making eye contact. He answered the kids in one-word responses when they asked him questions. The tension in the house felt like a physical presence sitting in every room. On the second night, Zoe knocked on my bedroom door after she was supposed to be asleep. She stood there in her pajamas with her arms wrapped around herself, looking small and scared. She asked me if the fighting was because of her grades. She asked if I was mad at Kevin because she got a B- in science. Something cracked open in my chest hearing her take responsibility for adult problems that had nothing to do with her. I pulled her into a hug and felt her shoulders shake against me. I told her to come sit on my bed and we needed to talk. I sat next to Zoe and took her hand in mine. I told her very clearly that adult problems were not her responsibility, and the tension between Kevin and me had nothing to do with her B-. I told her I was proud of her work ethic and her grades were excellent. I told her that 5 A grades and 1 B- was something to celebrate, not something to be punished for. I watched her face as I talked and saw some of the tightness around her eyes ease up. Her shoulders dropped down from where they had been hunched up near her ears. She asked me if I was sure she was not in trouble. I told her she was absolutely not in trouble, and I was sorry she had been made to feel like good grades were not good enough. She leaned against my shoulder and we sat like that for a while without talking. When she finally went back to her room, I could see she was standing a little straighter than when she came in. Kevin approached me on the third day while I was making coffee before work. He said he had been thinking and he wanted to propose a compromise. He said we could give both kids the same bedtime, so things were more equal. He said he would start checking Austin's homework more often to make sure he was keeping up. He looked at me like he expected praise for these suggestions. I poured my coffee and took a sip before I answered. I told him that addressed maybe 10% of the problem. I told him a shared bedtime did not fix years of holding Zoe to standards that Austin never had to meet. I told him checking homework did not acknowledge the damage already done to my daughter's sense of self-worth. Kevin's face got tight and he said he was trying to meet me halfway. I told him halfway would require him to actually understand how far apart we were, and he clearly did not. I told Kevin I wanted us to see a marriage counselor to work through this with professional help. He immediately started shaking his head and saying we did not need strangers in our business. He said we could figure this out ourselves without paying someone to tell us how to parent our kids. I set my coffee cup down hard enough that some sloshed over the side. I told him this was not optional. I told him we were going to counseling or we were going to see divorce lawyers and he could pick which one. Kevin stared at me for a long moment and I could see him trying to figure out if I was bluffing. I kept my face completely neutral and waited. Finally, he said fine, we would go to counseling, but he thought it was a waste of money. I told him I would add it to the list of things I paid for and walked out of the kitchen. Our first counseling session happened 2 weeks later in an office that smelled like lavender and had too many plants. Kevin spent the first 20 minutes presenting himself as the reasonable parent dealing with a wife who was overreacting to normal family dynamics. He used words like balanced and fair and appropriate expectations. The counselor was a woman in her 50s with gray hair and sharp eyes that did not miss anything. She listened to Kevin talk and took notes on a yellow pad. Then she turned to Kevin and asked him to provide specific examples of how he supported both children equally. Kevin opened his mouth and then closed it. He said he took Austin to basketball games. The counselor asked what he did with Zoe. Kevin said Zoe did not play sports. The counselor asked what activities Zoe enjoyed and what Kevin did with her to support those interests. Kevin stammered something about how Zoe liked reading, and he bought her books sometimes. The counselor asked when the last time was that he spent one-on-one time with Zoe doing something she chose. Kevin could not answer. He looked at me like I had set a trap for him. The counselor made more notes on her yellow pad. The counselor gave us homework before we left. She said we each needed to spend one-on-one time with both kids doing activities they enjoyed. She said Kevin needed to take Zoe somewhere she picked, and I needed to do something special with Austin. She said we would talk about how it went at our next session. Kevin agreed, but I could see the resistance in every line of his body. The next week, Kevin took Austin to a college basketball game and came home talking about how great it was and how Austin loved it. I asked him when he planned to do his activity with Zoe. He said something came up at work and he had to reschedule. I asked him what came up. He got vague and said it was complicated dealership stuff, and he would take Zoe out next weekend. Next weekend came and he had another excuse about needing to help a customer close a big sale. I wrote it all down in my phone notes to bring up at our next counseling session. 2 weeks after the parent conference, Austin's English teacher sent an email to both of us. She said Austin was still not turning in assignments and had failed the last 2 quizzes. She said his grade had dropped from a D to an F and he was in danger of failing the semester. The math teacher sent a similar email the same day. Kevin read the emails at the kitchen table and immediately started talking about hiring a tutor. He said Austin clearly needed extra help to understand the material. I put my phone down and looked at him directly. I told him Austin did not need a tutor. He needed consequences. I told him we needed to stop rewarding failure with more support Austin would not appreciate. Kevin said I did not understand how hard school was for Austin. I reminded him that Austin's teachers said he was bright but put in 0 effort, not that he struggled with the material. I told Kevin we were implementing a new rule starting immediately. Austin could not play video games or go out with friends until he brought his grades up to at least C level in every class. Kevin started to argue, but I cut him off. I told him this was not a discussion, and if he wanted to stay married to me, he would back me up on this. Kevin pressed his lips together and did not say anything else. I went to talk to Austin in his room and explained the new rule. He looked shocked, like he could not believe I was serious. He said that was not fair, and all his friends would be hanging out without him. I told him he should have thought about that before he stopped doing his homework. He slammed his door after I left, and I heard him texting someone immediately. 3 days later, Austin came to me while I was cooking dinner and told me he had been playing video games at home that afternoon. He said it like he was sharing good news and expected me to be happy for him. I stopped stirring the pasta and turned to look at him. I asked him what he meant because he knew the rule about no video games until his grades improved. Austin looked confused and said Kevin told him he could play for an hour as a break from studying. My hand tightened on the spoon and I felt heat rise up my neck. I thanked Austin for telling me and sent him to set the table. Then I went to find Kevin, who was watching television in the living room. I asked him if he let Austin play video games while I was at work. Kevin did not look away from the screen. He said Austin needed encouragement, not punishment, and an hour of gaming was a reasonable reward for doing some homework. I stood in front of the television, so Kevin had to look at me. I told him he deliberately sabotaged the consequences we agreed on. I told him he went behind my back and undermined the one boundary I set for Austin. Kevin said I was being too harsh and Austin needed positive reinforcement. I reminded him that Zoe got grounded for 2 weeks over a B-, but Austin still faced no real consequences for 3 F grades and months of missing assignments. I asked him how that was fair or reasonable, or anything other than the same double standard we had been fighting about for weeks. Kevin told me I was obsessed with making everything equal when kids were different and needed different approaches. I told him different approaches did not mean no standards at all for one kid and impossible standards for the other. Kevin stood up and said he was done with this conversation. I told him the conversation was not done until he started acting like a parent to both kids instead of just his son. I slept in the guest room that night because I could not stand to be near Kevin. The next morning he left for work before I woke up, and I was grateful for the space. I called my sister Heidi around 9 and asked if she could come over that weekend. She lived 2 hours away, but she said yes immediately because she heard something in my voice. She arrived Saturday afternoon with her daughter, who went to play video games with Austin while Heidi helped me make dinner. The kids ate early and went upstairs, and then Heidi and I opened a bottle of wine at the kitchen table. She looked around at the clean counters and the organized pantry and the framed family photos on the wall. She asked me how I was doing, and I started crying before I could answer. I told her everything. I told her about the different rules and the double standards and the report cards and the ice cream and the Sunday dinner confrontation. I told her about Kevin undermining the consequences for Austin and refusing to acknowledge what he was doing to Zoe. Heidi listened without interrupting and poured us both more wine. When I finished, she asked me a question that made my stomach hurt. She asked why I had tolerated this for so long. I did not have a good answer. I said something about wanting to keep the peace and believing Kevin would change and not wanting to disrupt the kids' lives. Heidi looked at me with so much sadness and said I was a single mom doing just fine before Kevin came along. She said I did not need him, especially if he was hurting my daughter. She reminded me that I paid for everything and owned the house and had a good job and could support Zoe on my own like I did for 6 years before the wedding. She said if I needed space to figure things out, she would let Zoe and me stay with her family for as long as we needed. I thanked her but said I was not ready to leave yet. I said I needed to understand my options first. Heidi nodded and told me to call a lawyer just to see where I stood. She said knowledge was power, and I should know what divorce would actually look like before I made any decisions. Monday morning, I looked up divorce attorneys during my lunch break at work. I found a firm called Fisher & Associates that had good reviews and specialized in family law. I called and made a consultation appointment for Wednesday afternoon. I told my boss I had a doctor's appointment and left work early. The law office was in a building downtown with gray carpet and framed degrees on every wall. The receptionist offered me coffee, and I sat in the waiting room trying not to think about what it meant that I was here. A man in his 50s came out and introduced himself as Wayne Fisher. He had kind eyes and a firm handshake, and he led me to his office. I sat in a leather chair across from his desk, and he asked me to tell him about my situation. I explained the whole thing again. The favoritism, the different standards, the financial imbalance, the house in my name. Wayne took notes and asked questions about how long we had been married and whether Kevin had any claim to the house and what my income looked like compared to his. I answered everything as honestly as I could. Wayne leaned back in his chair and told me that since the house was in my name before the marriage and I was the primary earner, I would be in a very strong position if I decided to file. He said Kevin would have limited claim to my assets, and I would likely keep the house and primary custody of Zoe. He called in his partner Hunter, who specialized in custody issues. Hunter was younger and wore glasses, and he explained that at Zoe's age, her preferences would be heavily weighted by a judge. He said if Zoe wanted to stay with me and could articulate why, the court would almost certainly honor that. He asked if there was any evidence of the unequal treatment, and I told him about my 3-page list and the notes on my phone. Hunter said that documentation would be very helpful if we needed it. I left the office an hour later with their business card in my purse and a strange feeling in my chest. The idea of divorce had always seemed scary and overwhelming, but Wayne and Hunter made it sound manageable. They made it sound like I had more power than I thought. I drove home and hid the business card in the zippered pocket of my purse where Kevin would not see it. That night at dinner, Kevin was quiet and tense, and the kids barely spoke. I went to bed early and lay awake thinking about everything Wayne and Hunter had said. Thursday morning, I was getting ready for work when Kevin asked to borrow $20 from my purse for gas. I told him my wallet was in there and he could take it. I was in the bathroom putting on makeup when I heard him yell my name from the bedroom. I came out and found him holding the business card from Fisher and Associates. His face was purple and a vein throbbed in his forehead. He asked me what this was and why I had a divorce lawyer's card in my purse. I stayed calm and told him I made a consultation to understand my options. Kevin lost his mind. He started yelling about how I was planning to destroy our family and turn the kids against him and steal everything he had. I let him yell for a minute and then I interrupted. I told him I was not planning to destroy our family. I was planning to protect my daughter. I said if protecting her destroyed our family, then our family was already broken and had been for a long time. Kevin threw the business card on the bed and told me I was crazy and vindictive. I picked up the card and put it back in my purse. I told him he had a choice to make about whether he wanted to actually change his behavior or keep pretending nothing was wrong. I said I was done pretending. Kevin did not speak to me for 3 days after that. He slept in the guest room and left for work early and came home late. The house felt like a minefield where nobody knew what would set off the next explosion. The next week, Zoe brought home a math test with a 92% score. She showed it to me first in the kitchen, and I told her it was excellent and I was proud of her. She smiled, but then Kevin walked in from the living room and asked to see the test. Zoe handed it to him, and I watched her shoulders tense. Kevin looked at the test, and instead of congratulating her, he started pointing at the problems she got wrong. He asked her why she missed that one and what she was thinking on this one, and whether she had been paying attention in class. He turned her accomplishment into a lecture about careless mistakes and not checking her work. I felt rage build in my chest like nothing I had ever felt before. I stepped between Kevin and Zoe, physically putting my body in the space between them. My voice was shaking when I told Kevin to stop talking to Zoe and go to another room right now. Kevin looked shocked, like he could not believe I was interrupting him. He started to argue, but I cut him off and told him to leave. Now. He walked out and I heard him go upstairs and slam a door. I turned to Zoe and pulled her into a hug. I told her that 92% was excellent and I was so proud of her hard work. I told her she should never let anyone make her feel bad about a grade that good. Zoe hugged me back and I felt her relax against me. After a minute, she pulled away and looked up at me with tears in her eyes. She asked me why Dad was so mean to her, but not to Austin. The question broke my heart because I knew she had been wondering this for years, and finally felt safe enough to ask. I sat down at the kitchen table and pulled her into the chair next to me. I struggled to find words that were honest but age-appropriate. I told her that sometimes people have unfair biases they do not even recognize in themselves. I said it was not her job to fix his problem or be perfect enough to earn fair treatment. I told her she deserved to be treated with respect and kindness no matter what, and the way he spoke to her was not okay. Zoe nodded and wiped her eyes. She asked if we were going to get divorced, and I told her honestly that I did not know yet, but I was working on making sure she felt safe and valued at home. That night after the kids went to bed, I found Kevin in our bedroom. I told him very clearly that if he ever criticized Zoe for a grade above 90% again, I was filing for divorce immediately. No more chances, no more discussions, just done. Kevin called me dramatic and said I was overreacting to normal parenting. I pulled the attorney's card out of my purse and held it up where he could see it. I told him to test me and find out how dramatic I was being. Something in my voice must have convinced him I was serious because his face changed. He sat down on the bed and put his head in his hands. He said he would do better. He promised to treat the kids more equally and stop being so hard on Zoe. I told him I needed to see consistent change over months, not just promises made in the heat of an argument. I said his behavior was now on a probation period and I was watching everything. Kevin looked up at me and nodded. He looked smaller somehow, like he finally understood that I meant what I said, and his position in this house was not as secure as he thought. I stayed up late that night in the home office with the door closed. I pulled out a yellow legal pad and drew a line down the middle of the page. On the left side, I wrote Zoe's name, and on the right side, I wrote Austin's name. Under each name, I wrote down expectations in 4 categories. Bedtime on the school nights would be 9 o'clock for both kids. Homework would be checked every evening for both kids before any screen time. Consequences for poor grades or missing assignments would apply equally to both kids based on effort and improvement. Praise would be given to both kids for hard work and progress regardless of final scores. I wrote it all out in clear, simple language that left no room for excuses or interpretation. At the bottom, I added a line for Kevin's signature and the date. The next morning, I waited until the kids left for school before I put the paper on the kitchen table in front of Kevin. He read it while drinking his coffee and his face got tight. He asked what this was supposed to be, and I told him it was a written agreement about how we would treat both kids fairly going forward. He said I was being ridiculous and treating him like a child who needed rules written down. I told him adults who keep their promises do not need written agreements, but adults who break their promises repeatedly do need them. Kevin stared at the paper for a long time. He picked up a pen and signed his name at the bottom with hard, angry strokes that nearly tore through the page. I took the paper and made a copy of it on our printer. I gave Kevin the original and kept the copy in my desk drawer. He walked out of the kitchen without saying anything else. For the first few days, Kevin actually followed the agreement. He checked Austin's homework on Tuesday night and discovered 3 missing assignments that Austin claimed he forgot about. Kevin made Austin sit at the table and complete all 3 before bed, even though Austin complained it was too much work. On Wednesday, Zoe showed Kevin a history project she finished early, and he told her it looked good without mentioning any mistakes or areas for improvement. On Thursday, both kids went to bed at 9, and I heard Kevin enforce the bedtime when Austin tried to stay up to finish a show. By Sunday, I started to feel a tiny bit hopeful that maybe the written agreement would actually work. That hope lasted exactly 1 week. The following Monday, Austin came home and said he forgot to turn in a math worksheet that was due that morning. Kevin said it was okay because the teacher would probably let him turn it in late for partial credit. I reminded Kevin that forgotten assignments were supposed to have consequences according to our agreement. Kevin said this was different because Austin actually did the work, he just forgot to turn it in. I asked how that was different from not doing it at all if the result was the same. Kevin said I was being too strict and not understanding that mistakes happen. That same week, Zoe brought home a social studies project with a 95% score. Kevin looked at it and asked why she did not get 100%. Zoe explained that she lost points for not including a bibliography page that she thought was optional. Kevin told her she should have asked the teacher to clarify the requirements before turning it in. I watched Zoe's face fall and I felt my hands start to shake. I went to my desk and pulled out the copy of our written agreement. I brought it to Kevin and pointed at his signature at the bottom. I asked him if he remembered signing this and promising to treat both kids equally. Kevin's face turned red and he said I was treating him like a child who needed rules and supervision. I told him he was acting like a child who could not keep his promises, and we were right back where we started before the agreement existed. Kevin said I was impossible to please and nothing he did was ever good enough. I said praising Zoe for a 95 instead of criticizing her would be good enough, and not making excuses for Austin's missing work would be good enough. Kevin threw his hands up and walked away. I heard him go upstairs and slam the bedroom door. The written agreement went back in my desk drawer, but I knew it was worthless now. Kevin had already proven he would follow it only when it was convenient, and ignore it when it was not. 2 days later, my cell phone rang at work with a number I did not recognize. I answered, and a man's voice said this was Julian calling from the dealership. Julian was Kevin's boss, and I had met him a few times at company events. He said he wanted to check in because Kevin had seemed distracted lately, and his sales numbers were down for the month. Julian asked if everything was okay at home. I felt my stomach drop because I realized Kevin had been complaining about me to his coworkers. Julian would not be calling me directly unless Kevin had said something that made him concerned. I kept my voice professional and told Julian we were working through some family issues, but I appreciated his concern. Julian said Kevin was a good salesman when he was focused, but lately he seemed like his head was somewhere else. I thanked Julian for letting me know and said I hoped Kevin would get back on track soon. After we hung up, I sat at my desk feeling my face get hot with anger. Kevin was painting me as the problem to people at his workplace. He was probably telling them I was unreasonable and demanding and making his life difficult. He was making himself the victim when he was the one who refused to treat my daughter fairly. I left work early that day and went straight home. I pulled out all our bank statements from the past 6 months and spread them across the dining room table. I got a highlighter and marked every expense I paid in yellow. Mortgage payment in yellow. Electric bill in yellow. Water bill in yellow. Gas bill in yellow. Grocery store charges in yellow. Car insurance in yellow. Health insurance in yellow. Internet and cable in yellow. Zoe's school supplies and activities in yellow. Austin's school supplies and activities in yellow. I went through every single statement and highlighted every charge that came from my account. When I finished, the pages were almost completely yellow. Then I went through Kevin's statements and highlighted his contributions in blue. His car payment in blue. His personal credit card in blue. Gas for his car in blue. Occasionally he bought groceries or paid for dinner out in blue, but those charges were maybe once or twice a month. The visual was stark. I was paying for literally everything that kept our household running while Kevin paid for his own car and his own spending money. I stacked all the statements in a pile and waited for Kevin to get home. Kevin walked in around 6:30 and I was sitting at the dining room table with the bank statements in front of me. He asked what I was doing and I told him to sit down because we needed to have a serious conversation about our future. Kevin sat down slowly and looked at the highlighted pages. I spread them out so he could see all the yellow and all the blue. I told him these were our finances for the past 6 months, and the yellow was everything I paid for, and the blue was everything he paid for. Kevin looked at the pages and his face went pale. I told him I was supporting a husband who would not respect my daughter in my own house. I said I was working 50 hours a week to pay for everything while he criticized Zoe for not being perfect and made excuses for Austin's failures. I said I was done. Kevin asked what that meant, and I told him I was giving him an ultimatum. He could commit to genuine family therapy and demonstrate real change in how he treated Zoe, or I wanted him to move out while we figured out if this marriage could be saved. Kevin said I was being extreme and threatening him again. I said I was being clear about my expectations, and he had 1 week to decide what he wanted to do. Kevin stared at the bank statements and did not say anything. I gathered up all the papers and took them back to my office. I heard Kevin sit at the table alone for a long time before he finally went upstairs. Kevin took 4 days to give me his answer. On Thursday night, he told me he would stay and commit to therapy. He said he wanted to save our marriage and he would work on being better. I told him I would call the therapist tomorrow and schedule our next session. Kevin nodded, but his face looked tight and angry. Over the next few days, Kevin followed all the rules technically, but with no warmth or real effort. He checked Austin's homework but sighed the whole time like it was a huge burden. He said good job to Zoe when she showed him a test score, but his voice was flat and his eyes were cold. He went to bed at a reasonable time and got up with the kids in the morning, but he barely spoke to anyone. He was sullen and withdrawn and clearly resentful of every single thing I had asked him to do. The atmosphere in the house felt heavy and tense. Zoe asked me if Dad was mad at her, and I told her no. Dad was working through some grown-up feelings that had nothing to do with her. Austin stopped trying to talk to Kevin about basketball because Kevin just grunted responses without looking up from his phone. Our next counseling session was scheduled for the following Tuesday. We sat in the therapist's office in the same chairs as before, but this time the silence felt different. The therapist asked how things had been going since our last session, and I said Kevin was technically following our agreements but seemed angry about it. The therapist turned to Kevin and asked if that was accurate. Kevin said yes. The therapist asked Kevin if he actually wanted to save this marriage, or if he was just going through the motions because I threatened him. Kevin sat there for a long moment and I could see his jaw working. Finally, he said he felt controlled and small. He said I was using my financial power to force him to do things my way. He said I was treating him like an employee instead of a partner, and making demands instead of requests. He said he felt like less of a man because I made more money and owned the house, and now I was holding all of that over his head. The therapist listened and then asked Kevin if he thought treating both children fairly was a controlling demand or a reasonable expectation. Kevin did not answer right away. The silence went on and on. Kevin shifted in his seat. He looked at the therapist, and then at me, and then down at his hands. The therapist waited. She did not fill the silence or rescue him. I watched him struggle and felt my stomach twist because part of me wanted him to finally say the truth, and part of me was scared of what would happen if he did. Kevin opened his mouth twice and closed it again. The clock on the wall ticked. Finally, he said it was a reasonable expectation. His voice came out quiet and flat. He said he knew he had been harder on Zoe. The therapist asked him to say more about that. Kevin rubbed his face with both hands and sat forward in his chair. He said he did not know why he did it. He said maybe it was because Zoe was not his biological daughter. He said maybe it was because she was always so capable, and he expected more from her. He said maybe he resented that she made everything look easy while Austin struggled. The words came out slow, like each one hurt. I sat there listening to my husband admit out loud what I had known for years. The therapist nodded and wrote something down. She asked Kevin if he understood that holding Zoe to higher standards because she was capable was still unfair. Kevin said yes. She asked if he understood that punishing Zoe for a B- while rewarding Austin for failing was damaging to both kids. Kevin said yes again. The therapist looked at me and asked how I felt hearing Kevin acknowledge this. I said I felt a tiny bit of hope. I said it was the first time he had admitted the truth instead of making excuses. But I also said I knew that saying it and changing it were two different things. The therapist agreed. She said acknowledging a problem was an important first step, but the real work was changing behavior. She turned back to Kevin and said she was going to give him some specific exercises to help him build his relationship with Zoe. She told him to spend 1 hour this week doing something Zoe enjoyed without Austin or me there. She told him to listen to Zoe talk about her interests without giving advice or criticism. She told him to notice when he felt the urge to correct her or set higher standards and to stop himself. Kevin wrote it all down in a small notebook. His handwriting looked shaky. That Saturday, Kevin took Zoe to the bookstore downtown. She loved reading and spent hours in her room with novels. Kevin had never shown interest in her books before. Zoe looked surprised when he asked her if she wanted to go. She asked if Austin was coming too, and Kevin said no, just the two of them. They were gone for over an hour. When they came back, Zoe was carrying a bag with 3 new books and her face looked different. Lighter somehow. She came into the kitchen where I was making dinner and said Dad was actually nice to her. She said he asked her about what she was reading and did not interrupt or tell her she should read something more educational. She said he bought her the books she wanted even though they were fantasy novels he usually said were a waste of time. She said it was weird, but good. I hugged her and felt something loosen in my chest. Over the next month, Kevin kept trying. It was not perfect and he still slipped into old patterns sometimes, but the trend was positive. He started praising Zoe when she brought home good grades instead of only pointing out what she got wrong. He told her he was proud of her science project. He said good job when she cleaned the kitchen without being asked. He also started holding Austin accountable for his schoolwork. He checked Austin's homework every night and made him redo assignments that were sloppy. He took away video games when Austin did not turn in work. Austin complained that I was mean and strict, and now Dad was being mean too. But his teachers started sending emails that said Austin was turning in more assignments. His grades went from F's and D's to D's and C's. It was not great, but it was progress. Austin's next report card showed a C in English, a D+ in math, and a C- in history. Kevin sat down with Austin and told him he was proud of the improvement. He said if Austin kept working, he could bring those D's up to C's by the end of the year. Austin actually seemed happy about the praise. Zoe's anxiety started going down. I could see it in how she carried herself. Her shoulders were not always up by her ears anymore. She smiled more. Tina, the school counselor, called me to say Zoe seemed lighter and more confident in their sessions. Tina said Zoe told her she felt like she could breathe now. When I heard that, I cried in my car in the school parking lot. One night, about 5 weeks after the ultimatum, Kevin and I had a real conversation instead of an argument. We were sitting in bed and he turned to me and said he needed to tell me something. He said he resented Zoe sometimes because she reminded him that I had a whole life before him. He said it was irrational and unfair. But when he looked at her, he saw proof that I loved someone else first. He said he knew it made no sense because Zoe's father was never in the picture, and Kevin was the only dad she knew. But the feeling was there anyway. He said naming it out loud helped him recognize when those feelings were influencing his behavior. I listened, and then I told him I had been carrying resentment too. I said I resented him for years of watching him hurt my daughter while I stayed silent to keep the peace. I said I resented myself for not protecting her sooner. I said I was angry that it took me threatening divorce to make him see what he was doing. Kevin said he was sorry. I said I was sorry too for not speaking up earlier. We both cried. It was not a magic fix, but it felt like something shifted. 6 weeks after I gave Kevin the ultimatum, we went back to the therapist. She asked how things had been going, and we told her about the changes. Kevin talked about taking Zoe to the bookstore and checking Austin's homework. I talked about seeing Zoe relax and Austin's grades improving. The therapist said we had made significant progress, but she warned us that lasting change required ongoing work. She said it was easy to slip back into old patterns when stress was high or when we were tired. She asked Kevin if he was willing to continue therapy. Kevin said yes. He said he wanted to do both marriage counseling and individual sessions to work on his deeper issues. The therapist scheduled our next appointment for 2 weeks out. 3 months passed since that night in the therapist's office. Our house felt different now. Lighter somehow. Kevin still messed up sometimes. Last Tuesday, he started to lecture Zoe about a 94% on her English paper before he caught himself mid-sentence. He stopped talking, took a breath, and told her the grade was great. She looked shocked for a second and then smiled. I watched from the kitchen doorway and felt something loosen in my chest. These moments happened more often now. Kevin would slip into his old patterns, but then he would notice and correct himself. Sometimes I had to point it out. He would get defensive for maybe 30 seconds, and then he would apologize. Real apologies. Not the fake kind where he blamed me for being too sensitive. He started checking Austin's homework every night at the kitchen table. Austin complained about it constantly, but his missing assignments went from 12 to 3 to 0 over the course of 2 months. His teachers stopped sending worried emails. The principal called once to say she noticed improvement and wanted to encourage whatever we were doing at home. Kevin actually seemed proud of that call. He told Austin he was doing good work, and Austin rolled his eyes, but I saw him trying not to smile. Zoe brought home her next report card on a Friday in February. 5 A's and 1 B+ in math. She handed it to Kevin at dinner, and I held my breath. Kevin looked at the grades, and his face broke into a real smile. He told her this was excellent work, and he was proud of her. That was it. No mention of the B+. No lecture about the points she missed. Just genuine praise for what she accomplished. Zoe's whole face lit up like someone turned on a switch inside her. She thanked him quietly, and I saw her hands relax on the table. Later that night, she came to my room and asked if Dad really meant what he said. I told her yes, he meant it. She hugged me for a long time without saying anything else. Austin's report card came 2 weeks later. 3 C's, 2 B's, and 1 D in science. It was not perfect, but it was massive progress from 3 F's. We made his favorite dinner that night, chicken parmesan with garlic bread. Austin ate 3 helpings and talked about his history project on World War II. Kevin asked him questions about what he learned, and Austin actually answered instead of shrugging. After dinner, Austin helped me load the dishwasher without being asked. He said trying in the school felt weird at first, but now it felt better than failing. He said his friends noticed he was getting better grades and it made him feel less stupid. I told him he was never stupid, just not trying. He nodded and said he knew that now. Our family still has problems. Kevin and I still argue sometimes about money or schedules or whose turn it is to drive the kids somewhere. Austin still plays too many video games and Zoe still worries too much about everything. But we function now in ways we did not before. I learned that protecting my daughter was not destroying my family. It was saving it. Sometimes the people who love you need clear boundaries to become better versions of themselves. Kevin is genuinely trying now. The kids are both doing better. I finally feel like my voice matters in my own home. I stopped walking on eggshells around Kevin's moods. I stopped making excuses for behavior that hurt my daughter. I started trusting myself to know when something was wrong and to speak up about it. That Sunday dinner confrontation changed everything. It was not easy, and it was not fast, but it was necessary. My daughter deserved a home where she felt valued, and my stepson deserved a father who held him accountable. I gave them both those things by refusing to stay quiet anymore.